Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for your time. There you go. That's a hard act to follow. I'm not a member of Anonymous. If I was, I wouldn't tell you. What can I add in 15 minutes? Well, I want to talk to you this morning about inverting the asymmetry that I think is inherent in the cybersecurity space. As we sit here as a group, I think of cybersecurity or technology specialists, we're facing overwhelming odds. I think we live in a reality that's captured by this analogy of running with the bulls in Pamplona. I think cybersecurity is something that's characterized by chaos and unpredictability and, frankly, quite overwhelming odds. We heard the anonymous guys talking about the likes of the NSA and the CIA, the Israeli group, the NSO, and there are many other sort of state forces at play in the information security space. And that's without talking about what's happening in the cybercrime ecosystem, the amount of innovation, both in terms of crime and in terms of technology that's happening there. And then there are these other systemic forces, the pressure from business to transform in terms of technology, the pressure from regulators and other authorities to comply with various norms. And then, of course, all these other systemic changes that are really shifting the odds against us from a cybersecurity point of view. And so I think we live in a space where ultimately, certainly attack and I think compromise are inevitable. And so defense, I think, is increasingly hard. In fact, there's this narrative emerging that suggests that defense may be almost impossible. So in the face of, the kinds of, activities that were described there against the Danish parliament, where a state agency is cooperating with a major technology manufacturer to subvert security, what do we do? How do we operate in a space like that? And so there's the sense, I think, that compromise ultimately will be forgiven. You can make mistakes. I think it's understood that those mistakes are going to happen now, and that compromises will happen. What's a little less forgiven at the moment is being blind, is not knowing, is not noticing. And the lady from Darktrace, I think, was alluding to some of that also, this notion of having visibility in your environment, being able to see when things happened. Anonymous also spoke about a packet capture that noticed anomalous traffic moving out from those iPhones. And so there's an expectation on us that we see, that we know, that we're ready to respond when these things happen. So how do we do this? Well, there's a drive to have comprehensive and capable detection technologies, systems, platforms in place within our networks. And there are three drivers behind that, I believe. The first is, I think it's increasingly understood that a defense in-depth strategy needs you to also have visibility. It's no longer acceptable to try and stop things from happening at the perimeter and on the endpoint. You also need to be able to see what's happening. If you can't see what's happening, you can't say we're doing everything we should be doing. Then there's this compliance drive that I spoke about earlier, not only in terms of specific kind of regulatory compliance, but also just a sense of best practice that we need to get behind. We need to have something in place that gives us visibility. And then something that's not spoken about enough, and I'll touch on this later, is I think there's a readiness drive. I think when something happens, when you discover something anomalous, when a piece of ransomware hits, you want to be in a position to say, how did it get here? What did it touch? Who did it affect? What does it mean? And that requires that we have some sort of visibility program in place within our environments. So given that driver, in the little bit of time that I've got available, what can I say to you about that? How can I equip you to think about that part of your problem, that part of your workload? Well, I think the first thing I want to say is, if we accept this notion that we are facing overwhelming odds, so stolen that analogy of the bulls, there's this image from outside the New York Stock Exchange in Manhattan. They call her the fearless girl. She's a little statue that's staring down this bull. I love the image. I think it's very beautiful. How do we do that? How do we find the courage and develop the systems to stare down this bull? And I want to put it to you that although there is this asymmetry that apparently favors the attacker. I think there are elements of that asymmetry that favor us also, that can be leveraged. And that if we think about our strengths relative to the attacker, rather than the attacker's strengths, that puts us in a better position to think smart and be effective in terms of detecting and disrupting these kinds of attacks. And I want to give you just 3 pointers to think about to guide your thinking around it, a sort of detection or visibility program within your environment. And the first is to know your enemy, to understand what the attacker does and how they work, and therefore to understand where they are weak. The second, which I think is almost more important, is to leverage the fundamental strength that you have over the attacker, which is that you understand your own environment. I think you were talking about this also. There are patterns, there are systems, there are places in your network which you can understand easily and at low cost, which are very expensive and difficult for the attacker to understand. And that's something we can leverage. And then the third thing I would say to you, a little bit at odds with our previous speakers, is although there's a place for technology, technology is not going to solve this problem for us. I think it's a people and a principles problem. And I want to dive with just very brief examples into each of these 3 points for you this morning. So, knowing your enemy. There's a lot that goes on that talks about the APTs, that talks about the threat actor groups, that talks about attribution. Was it the Chinese or the North Koreans or the Russians or anonymous in Scandinavia? That's not what I mean when I say know your enemy. I think when I talk about know your enemy, I'm talking specifically about the kill chain. So understanding the steps, the processes that the attacker has to go through to effect a compromise. And some of that is very dynamic, changes all the time, is difficult to understand. But some of it, particularly the edges, pre-attack and post-attack, are relatively static. The attacker is forced into funnels down narrow paths where we can understand them. And the industry is responding by building programs that help us to understand this. And so I want to draw your attention this morning under the heading Know Your Enemy to something that the MITRE Foundation is doing called the Attack Framework, ATT and CK, which is a system that allows us to literally break down for every stage of the kill chain what kinds of things we can expect an attacker to do and what those things are likely to look at in your environment. And I promise you, vendors like Darktrace are acutely aware of these. And other vendors should be too. And if you're in the space of developing a system or a program that is trying to detect attacks in your environment, I would draw your attention to these frameworks as a way of guiding what a technology or a system or a service should be able to do for you. Just one example of knowing your enemy. In terms of knowing yourself, I also just want to give you one example. I'll be talking about this later in a presentation just after 11, where I'll sort of go into more elements of this. It's something I'm very passionate about. But I just want to give you one example of how that asymmetry can be leveraged to our advantage. And it's in the form of honeypots and honey tokens. Now, honeypots is a technology that's been around for many, many years. It sort of comes in and out of favor every half a decade or so. I think it's back in favor, and it's back in favor in a very specific form, which is in the form of traps. And traps are computers, directories, files, user accounts, any element of your system that you deliberately place somewhere for the purpose of tripping up an attacker. Because you know what your normal users and your normal systems look like. You can easily seed that environment with, as I said, people, resources, platforms that normal users have no business interacting with. This is an example of what we call a honey token file. It's a standard Word document. It has embedded in it a very, very benign callback mechanism, a little bit like what a piece of malware would do. As soon as a document is opened up from any location within or outside your environment, it calls out and says, I've been opened up, and here's what I know about who opened me up. And what we can, for example, do is we can then trigger an alert on our scene that says that document has been opened, or that user's been interacted with, or that directory has been browsed, or that computer's been connected to. It's a very high fidelity, low cost, low noise way of knowing that something is happening in your environment that fundamentally leverages that asymmetry to your advantage. These things are available commercially. There are various vendors that sell them, but also for free and in open source platforms. So in terms of knowing your enemy, just one example of how that asymmetry can be leveraged to your advantage. What I really want to talk about is people and principles. So there are many technology platforms that can give us visibility into our networks. My colleague from Darktrace was talking about number 3, detection on the wire, leverages machine learning. It's very exciting. It's very promising. But I want to put it to you today that none of these technology platforms on their own is going to give us the visibility that we need. They're all useful, probably in some combination of them. But if you're thinking around establishing a high level of visibility in your environment depends on a technology, then I think you're thinking about it wrong. What I would put it to you is that you rather think about using the technology in the context of these 5 principles. And the first I've touched on already, which is deliberateness. Is let's know what we're looking for. With respect, I believe the idea that we can collect a whole lot of information and throw it into some big bucket and hope that advanced intelligence, analytics, machine learning, or even people are going to find the noise in that bucket, I think is misplaced. I think we need to know exactly what we're looking for and where we hope to see it. And that's where something like the attack framework from MITRE comes in. The second touches on the same point, is about the judicious selection of technology. In that framework, if you're selecting technology to support your visibility effort, then it's important to understand exactly which part of that picture a specific technology is going to color in for you, right? There's an entire matrix of things we need to look for and places where we need to look for them. And some technologies are going to be good for some of those, and other technologies are going to be good for others. So be judicious in your selection of technology. The third is, and this is the most boring part, is you have to be structured. Detection at this point, visibility is a process-based thing. Think about those guys scanning bags at the airport, watching those bags go through millions a day. How do you ensure that there's somebody with eyes open on every single bag that comes past, number 1, but still awake enough and interested enough and motivated enough to actually differentiate like a bomb from a tube of toothpaste? And it's an incredibly difficult thing to do that is about process and managing people and ensuring consistency. That needs to be a key focus, specifically when something happens, when they see that thing that looks suspicious. Knowing that you've got the processes in place to respond to that is incredibly important. Fourthly, I think you need to be fundamentally research-led, meaning you need to have the capability to understand, to discern what's happening in the environment around you and be able to adapt your detection program to respond to that. And I'm not talking about new variants of malware or new indicators of compromise or CNC addresses. I'm talking about fundamental shifts in the landscape that may happen outside of you or that you may become aware of that are going to change what you're looking for. And your program needs to be able to adapt to those changes. And finally, I would say your program needs to be specific and transparent. If a service provider, your team, a vendor can't tell you exactly what a technology or a system is going to tell you about what, then I would say it's more noise than it's worth, right? So programs that require you to believe terms like advanced analytics, with respect AI, as the fundamental premise of what that thing is bringing, I think one needs to be cautious of, and you need to break that down and say, what specifically is this going to tell me about what? Then I want to talk briefly about people. I love this story. It's from the US Marine Corps. A couple of years old now, 2017. But it talks about this idea of, it's only the military could come up with this, lateral entry into the military. Lateral entry. A lateral entry is this idea that you can join the Marine Cyber Corps without first being a Marine grunt, effectively. The Marine have this ancient tradition that says, before you do any job in the Marines, you do boot camp, and you learn to fire an M16, and you crawl around in the mud. And that's the base for everyone who's a Marine, except if you're in cyber. And why are they doing that? Because they're so desperate to attract and retain skills in the cyberspace that they're willing to compromise on this age-old tradition. And I want to put it to you that right now, and it might not be the case for the future, but right now, in the detection space, if you want to be effective, you need to know that you can attract, retain, train, and motivate the people who are doing it, because it's still fundamentally, I believe, a skills and an energy and a passion-based exercise. How much? Finished? 2 minutes. All right. So let me speak to you quickly about how you can bring some of those skills in place. One of the ways is via outsourcing, and there's 3 ways that I believe, to think about outsourcing. The first is about fundamentals. As I said, I think it's boring. It's about keeping that guy in front of the scanner If your business is not in a position to do that, then think about outsourcing. Finally, you need to think about those skills. Take the Marine Corps story. If your business is not able to attract and keep and motivate those kinds of people, then I think you need to think about outsourcing. And finally, I want to say, in terms of agility, if you're not in a position to monitor the landscape, to understand what's happening around you, and having established that base of the 4 Ps, then pivot again around new threats and new attacks, then you probably want to think about outsourcing. And very briefly, I would say these are the things that you want to look for in an outsourced provider also that can assist you with a program like that. All right, and I'm out of time. I think I just snuck through. I only had those 3 points to make. So thank you very much for your time.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. You will have the opportunity to listen to Charl in one of the seminars, but thank you for your insights. We're now going to break for coffee. Can you be back in this room for seminar 1, Imagine Room 1 and Imagine Room 2 for the...